else with him. Twice. I have no wish to marry him. You may not object to lowering yourself, but I will not have you ruin your sister's chances of a match.
She was never meant to be remembered, yet somehow she was always there watching everything unfold. While everyone praised Elizabeth, adored Jane, and talked about Lydia's chaos, one sister was quietly fading into the walls of her own story. But now, that forgotten silence is breaking, and Mary Bennet is finally stepping into a world that never once waited for her. There are stories where a character is loved, and then there is Mary Bennet, the one who was never chosen for attention, never chosen for praise, never chosen for love that felt warm instead of duty-bound. In the world of Regency England, where every smile is a strategy and every conversation hides intention, the Bennet household is already overflowing with noise. But in that noise, Mary Bennet becomes something worse than ignored. She becomes invisible, not because she has nothing to offer, but because no one ever looks long enough to notice what she is offering. She reads when others gossip, she thinks when others react, and she stays silent in a family where being loud is mistaken for being important. In her own home, she is treated like an extra detail in a painting no one bothers to study. Her sisters shine in different ways, Jane with her beauty, Elizabeth with her wit, Lydia with her reckless charm, but Mary is the one standing just out of frame, as if the story itself forgot to include her properly, and that is exactly where her life begins to change. In this Spotlight Stories adaptation, the Other Bennet Sister doesn't try to fix Mary. It doesn't try to turn her into someone she is not. Instead, it forces the world around her to finally see what it has been ignoring for too long. Because Mary Bennet is not empty. She is just unspoken. Her father barely acknowledges her presence unless necessary, treating her like a quiet obligation rather than a daughter with thoughts of her own. Her mother, obsessed with marriages and social advancement, looks past Mary as if she is a mistake in the family design, someone who will not help secure the future she dreams of. And slowly, without drama or noise, that kind of neglect does something dangerous. It teaches Mary to shrink herself, to speak less, to expect less, to want less. But what makes this story different is that silence never stays harmless for long. Everything begins to shift when Mary is taken under the care of her aunt and uncle, stepping away from the suffocating rhythm of her household. For the first time, she is placed in an environment where she is not just another Bennet daughter, but a young woman expected to learn, observe, and exist outside of judgment. And this is where the world starts to crack open for her. New places enter her life, not as decorations, but as possibilities. London is not just noise anymore. It becomes a question mark. The countryside is not just scenery. It becomes space to breathe. Even people she meets begin to feel less like strangers and more like reflections of lives she never thought she could touch. But the most dangerous change is not outside of her. It is inside her. Because once Mary starts seeing the world differently, she cannot unsee what her old life truly was. A life where she was never encouraged to shine. A life where her thoughts were never asked for. A life where even her intelligence felt like something inconvenient instead of valuable. And now, for the first time, a quiet question begins forming in her mind. What if she was never meant to stay invisible? This is not a sudden transformation. There is no dramatic moment where she becomes fearless overnight. Instead, it is something far more unsettling. Small realizations, quiet disappointments, moments where she begins to understand that the world she trusted has been quietly deciding her worth without ever asking her opinion. And the more she notices it, the harder it becomes to pretend she doesn't. In this spotlight version of her story, even the smallest details carry weight. the way she observes people instead of speaking over them, the way she hesitates before entering a room as if she is still unsure she belongs in it, the way she listens more carefully than anyone else, not because she is shy, but because she has learned that listening is safer than being dismissed. But safety has a limit, because once a person understands they have been underestimated for too long, silence starts to feel less like protection and more like imprisonment. And Mary Bennet, for the first time in her life, is beginning to feel the edges of that prison. The world is still the same. The expectations have not changed. The rules of society are still firmly in place, deciding who is worthy of attention and who is not. But something inside her is no longer fully agreeing with those rules, and that disagreement is where everything begins to shift. Because once Mary steps outside the life she was assigned, she will discover there is no going back to the version of herself that accepted being unseen. And the question now is not whether she will change, but what will happen the moment the world finally realizes she already has. There is a strange moment in every overlooked life when the world that ignored you suddenly begins to look back, not with love, not with understanding, but with confusion. That is exactly where Mary Bennet finds herself when she steps further away from the Bennet household and into a life that was never designed to include her voice. At first, nothing dramatic happens. There are no grand entrances, no sudden declarations, no one magically recognizing her worth. Instead, there is something far more realistic and far more uncomfortable. She is noticed in fragments. A sentence she speaks that surprises someone, a quiet observation that turns out to be correct, a moment where her silence is mistaken for intelligence instead of weakness. And for the first time, people do not know how to place her, because Mary Bennet does not fit the category they assigned her. She is not charming in the traditional sense, she is not loud enough to be entertaining, and she is not invisible enough to be ignored anymore. She is something in between, and that in between is what unsettles everyone around her. In this Spotlight Stories version of her life, Mary enters a space where she is expected to serve, observe, and remain properly restrained. Working under her aunt and uncle as a governess is not freedom in the romantic sense. It is structure, it is responsibility, it is discipline. But for Mary, it is also the first environment where her existence has purpose beyond marriage expectations. She is no longer just a Bennet sister waiting to be evaluated. She is someone who must think, act, respond, learn. And that simple shift changes everything. Because responsibility does something powerful to people who were previously dismissed. It forces them to grow in ways nobody prepared for. Mary begins to understand that intelligence was never her problem. It was just never rewarded in her previous world. In her new environment, she is exposed to conversations that stretch her mind beyond the narrow expectations of her upbringing. Ideas about education, independence, morality, and self-worth begin to challenge everything she was quietly taught to accept without question. And slowly, she starts to realize something uncomfortable. She was not lacking value. She was just in a place that refused to see it. But awareness is not comfort. It is pressure. Because the moment Mary starts understanding her own potential, she also starts noticing how much of it has been buried under years of silence. And that silence does not disappear easily. It follows her into every interaction. Even when she speaks more clearly now, there is still a hesitation beneath her words, as if she is waiting for someone to interrupt her thoughts and declare them unimportant again. But something is changing in how people respond to her. They are no longer dismissing her immediately. Instead, they are watching her more closely. Not because they admire her yet, but because they cannot figure her out. And in a world built on quick judgments, being uncategorized is almost more dangerous than being disliked. There is also something quietly symbolic about Mary's presence in this new life. The way she observes before she participates, the way she calculates social space before stepping into it, the way she carries herself like someone who has spent years preparing for rejection and is now unsure how to behave without it. Even her physical world becomes a reflection of her internal shift. Small details begin to matter more than they used to. The distance between herself and others in a room, the tone of a sentence, the pause before a response. All of it becomes data she unconsciously collects as she tries to understand how people truly see her. But the most dangerous part of this transformation is not how others see her. It is how she begins to see herself. Because once Mary starts recognizing patterns of dismissal, she can't stop noticing them. Not in her family, not in society, not even in moments where she is being politely tolerated. And tolerance is not respect. That realization hits harder than anything she has experienced before. It changes how she listens, how she reacts, how she interprets even the smallest social interactions. And somewhere beneath all of this awareness, a deeper tension begins to form. Because Mary is no longer simply observing the world, she is starting to question it. And questioning a world built on rigid expectations is never quiet. It always leads somewhere unpredictable. Especially for someone like Mary Bennet, who was never supposed to be the one asking questions in the first place. And now, the most unsettling part begins to emerge, because the more she steps into this new life, the more she starts to realize that her presence is not just being noticed, it is being evaluated in ways she was never prepared for. There's a moment in Mary Bennet's journey where everything looks the same on the surface, but nothing feels the same inside her. The rooms are still structured, the people are still polite, the rules are still unspoken but very much present. Yet something subtle has changed. Because Mary is no longer moving through this world as someone who accepts it without question. She is watching it. And once you start watching the world too closely, it stops being simple. In this new chapter of her life, Mary begins to experience something unfamiliar, not attention, not admiration, but recognition in small, uncomfortable flashes. Someone pauses when she speaks. Someone reconsiders a judgment after she leaves the room. Someone asks her opinion without immediately dismissing it. These are not victories, they are disruptions. Because Mary Bennet was never meant to disrupt anything. She was meant to stay predictable. And now she's becoming something else entirely. In the Spotlight Story's interpretation of her life, Mary's time as a governess becomes more than just employment. It becomes exposure. Exposure to people outside her family, outside her assumptions, and outside the narrow identity she was assigned at birth. And exposure changes perception faster than anything else. She begins to notice how differently people behave when status is uncertain, how kindness can still carry hierarchy, how respect is often given conditionally, not freely, and how even in new spaces, old rules still quietly survive. But the most dangerous realization is not about society, it is about herself. Because Mary starts to understand that she has been participating in her own invisibility for years, not by choice, but by conditioning. Every time she chose silence over risk, every time she lowered her voice to avoid correction, every time she convinced herself that speaking less meant being safer. She was not disappearing, she was adapting. And adaptation, when it lasts too long, starts to feel like identity. But now, something inside her resists that identity. It does not arrive loudly, it does not arrive with certainty, it arrives as discomfort, a hesitation before shrinking herself again, a pause before accepting being overlooked, a strange awareness that she has started predicting other people's dismissal before they even express it. And that prediction is what changes everything. Because once you start expecting invisibility, you start noticing every moment it happens. Mary's emotional world becomes more complex as she begins to understand that intelligence alone was never enough to be seen. In fact, in her previous life, intelligence without confidence only made her easier to ignore. But in this new environment, intelligence begins to take on a different weight. It becomes a tool, a voice, a way of existing in space that cannot be easily dismissed. Still, she does not fully trust it yet, because trust takes longer to rebuild than awareness. And Mary has spent years being taught that her thoughts are secondary, her opinions optional, and her presence negotiable. So even when she speaks with clarity, there is still a shadow of doubt behind her words, as if she is waiting for someone to correct her existence. But what unsettles her most is not how others react. It is when they start listening. Really listening. Not politely, not briefly, but with hesitation, as if they are realizing too late that she has been observing everything far more carefully than they assumed. And that shift creates tension she does not yet know how to navigate. Because being underestimated is familiar, being taken seriously is not. In this spotlight world, Mary's interactions begin to carry double meaning. A simple conversation becomes layered with unspoken negotiation. Every exchange feels like a test she was not told she is taking. And she is beginning to realize something important. She is no longer invisible, but she is not fully seen either. She is in a transition state where people are slowly rewriting their understanding of her in real time, and that process is never smooth. It is awkward, it is inconsistent, it is full of contradiction. One moment she is dismissed without effort, the next she is questioned with unexpected seriousness. And this inconsistency begins to shake something deeper inside her, because it proves that perception is not fixed, it is fragile. And if it is fragile, it can be changed. That thought alone is dangerous, because it introduces a possibility Mary has never fully allowed herself to consider before. What if the version of her the world has always seen was never final? And if that version can change, then so can everything that follows. There's a point in Mary Bennet's journey where understanding herself is no longer the hardest part. It is deciding what to do with that understanding. Because awareness, once it settles in, does not stay quiet. It begins to reshape everything it touches, her thoughts, her decisions, even the way she looks at the people around her. And suddenly, the world does not feel like a fixed place anymore. It feels negotiable. In this stage of her life, Mary is no longer just reacting to her surroundings. She is starting to evaluate them. Every conversation carries weight. Every social expectation feels like a question she was never asked to answer. And every rule she once accepted without thought now feels suspiciously optional. But that realization does not bring freedom immediately. It brings conflict. Because Mary Bennet was not raised to question her place in the world. She was raised to accept it quietly, without resistance, without complaint, and without expectation of change. So when she begins to imagine something different, it feels almost unnatural. Not because she is incapable of change, but because she was never prepared for it. In this Spotlight Stories version of her journey, her exposure to a broader world through her work as a governess becomes the turning point where internal curiosity starts clashing with inherited limitation. She begins to see lives that operate under different assumptions, women who speak with more certainty, people who make decisions based on preference rather than permission, and conversations where intelligence is not treated as a threat, but as a normal part of identity. And slowly, a difficult truth starts forming in her mind. The rules she grew up under are not universal. They are specific. And specificity means they can be questioned. But questioning is never comfortable for someone like Mary because it creates distance between who she was taught to be and who she is beginning to become. That distance grows quietly, not in dramatic rebellion, not in sudden transformation, but in small, almost invisible shifts. The way she responds instead of remaining silent, the way she allows herself to disagree internally before immediately accepting correction. The way she starts noticing how often she was interrupted in her own life without ever realizing it was happening. And each realization adds another layer of tension, because now she understands something painful. She was not just unseen, she was shaped by being unseen. And shaping is harder to undo than neglect. There is also a growing emotional conflict inside her, one she does not yet have language for. It is the tension between safety and selfhood, between staying within the boundaries she knows and stepping into a version of life that offers uncertainty, but also possibility. Safety tells her to remain quiet, to avoid attention, to stay within familiar expectations where disappointment is predictable. But something deeper inside her is starting to resist that logic, not because she wants rebellion for its own sake, but because she has begun to realize that safety has been costing her something she cannot